It began on Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a date synonymous with home, family, and the busiest travel day of the year. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was a routine commuter hop running from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. The passengers were businessmen, college kids, and families, all just trying to get home for the holiday. Among them was a quiet man in seat 18C. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a dark business suit, a crisp white shirt and a black necktie. He looked like any other executive. He ordered a bourbon and soda, paid his tab, and lit a cigarette. Shortly after takeoff, he passed a note to the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. She, assuming it was a lonely businessman's phone number, slipped it into her pocket. He leaned in calmly and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." This was the opening move in the most audacious and most baffling skyjacking in American history. The man who had purchased his ticket under the name Dan Cooper would, for the next 4 hours, hold the plane, its passengers, and the nation hostage with chilling, polite precision. He would receive a $200,000 ransom. He would demand 4 parachutes. And then he would do the impossible. He would jump from the aft stairs of a Boeing 727 at 10,000 feet into a freezing 200-mile-per-hour windstorm over the most rugged, unforgiving wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, and then he vanished. This is the central paradox of D.B. Cooper. How does a man in the modern age hijack a commercial airliner, extort a fortune, leap into oblivion, and leave behind nothing? No body, no parachute, no briefcase, and for 50 years, no conclusive identity. This wasn't just a crime. It was a magic trick. It was the birth of America's greatest unsolved mystery. Today, we are not just investigating a cold case. We are attempting to dissect the mind of a phantom.
To understand the D.B. Cooper case, we must first accept a difficult truth. There are no formative years to analyze. There is no childhood, no known trauma, no jilted lover, no disgruntled employee. The man known as Dan Cooper, the DB, was a media error that stuck, has no past. He is a ghost, a John Doe in a business suit. Therefore, our psychological profile cannot be built from a life lived, but from the 4 hours of testimony provided by the people who were there, most notably the flight attendants, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. And the portrait they paint is what makes this case so singular. He was not the typical hijacker of the era, not a panicked political dissident, not a crazed fugitive. The crew's universal description of him was calm. He was polite. He was professional. When he told Florence he had a bomb, he wasn't aggressive. He was factual. When she saw the nest of red wires in his briefcase, he calmly assured her it was real. He was a man at work. His demeanor was so disarming that Tina Mucklow, the 22-year-old attendant who spent the most time with him, described him as thoughtful, never cruel, and rather kind. He insisted on paying his drink tab for his bourbon and soda, even as he was extorting $200,000. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman bandit. This polite facade is, itself, a crucial psychological clue. It suggests a high level of compartmentalization. This was not a crime of passion. It was a business transaction. But beneath the politeness was a core of steel. His demands were incredibly specific. He didn't just ask for parachutes. He asked for 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve. He didn't just ask to fly. He demanded they fly unpressurized, below 10,000 feet, with the flaps at 15 degrees, and the aft stairs, the jet's rear exit, unlocked. This is the key to his profile. He possessed highly specific and somewhat obscure aviation knowledge. He knew the unique capabilities of a Boeing 727. He knew lowering the aft stairs in flight was possible. He knew the precise flap settings to maintain a slow, stable jump platform. This was not an amateur. This profile is a bundle of contradictions. A man polite enough to pay his bill but ruthless enough to threaten a bombing. A man who was an expert in aviation, but a questionable expert in skydiving, given the lethal conditions. We are not looking for a madman. We are looking for a professional, someone with a deep familiarity with the aviation world, who saw a systemic weakness and had the cold-blooded audacity to exploit it.
Because we cannot know the personal trigger for D.B. Cooper, we must analyze the societal trigger. What was it about 1971 that made this crime not only possible but mythic? The answer is that Cooper was a man perfectly suited to his time. He operated in a brief, specific window of history that has been closed forever. The golden age of flying. In 1971, air travel was as simple as boarding a bus. There was no TSA, there was no security. There was no ID check. You could walk up to a counter, pay cash for a one-way ticket under any name you wanted, like Dan Cooper, and walk onto the plane carrying anything you liked, including a briefcase you claimed held a bomb. Cooper didn't beat security. There was no security to beat. The entire airline industry ran on an honor system, and he was the man who proved that system was a catastrophic failure. Furthermore, hijacking itself was almost commonplace. The 1960s and early 70s were the golden age of skyjacking, with dozens of planes being diverted, mostly to Cuba, for political reasons. It was so common that airlines often had Cuban landing charts in the cockpit, just in case. But Cooper's crime was different. It was a profound trigger for the public because it wasn't political. It was financial. It was pure, unapologetic, capitalist theft. And this resonated deeply with the American public of 1971. The nation was mired in the hopeless, unpopular Vietnam War. There was a deep-seated distrust of the government and the establishment. Inflation was high, the economy was stagnant. Cooper, in this context, was not seen as a terrorist. He was seen as a folk hero. He was a blue-collar legend, a modern-day Jesse James. He was the little guy who, with nothing but a briefcase and a bold plan, stuck it to the man, the faceless airline, the bungling FBI, and won. This societal context is the true trigger. The lack of security made the crime possible. The public's anti-establishment mood made the criminal a hero. D.B. Cooper was not just a man. He was a cultural phenomenon, a fantasy of escape and rebellion for a generation that felt trapped. He was the right criminal, at the right time, exploiting a vulnerability that would be slammed shut forever just moments after he leaped.
The procedure of the hijacking itself was a masterclass in calm, methodical control. At approximately 3 p.m. on November 24, 1971, Cooper handed the note to Florence Schaffner. She passed it unread to the cockpit. The captain, William Scott, read the demands: $200,000 in negotiable American currency and 4 parachutes. Cooper's chilling threat of a bomb and his calm demeanor convinced the crew this was not a hoax. Captain Scott got on the radio. Northwest Orient's President Donald Nyrop gave the order: cooperate. The hijacking of Flight 305 was now underway. For the next 2 hours, the 727 circled Puget Sound, burning fuel, while on the ground, a frantic scramble began. FBI agents and airline officials raced to assemble the money, $10,000 $20 bills, many of which they hastily photographed to record the serial numbers. They scrambled to find the parachutes, locating them at a local skydiving school. The 35 other passengers on board were told nothing, only that they were in a holding pattern due to a minor mechanical issue. At 5:39 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Cooper had the plane taxi to a remote, brightly lit section of the tarmac, away from the terminal. He demanded the cabin lights be dimmed to thwart any potential police snipers. An airline employee, clad only in street clothes to prove he was unarmed, walked the cash-filled knapsack and the parachutes to the aft stairs. Cooper had Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant, retrieve them. He then calmly released all 35 passengers and Florence Schaffner. He kept only the essential flight crew, Captain Scott, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and Tina Mucklow. This is when the second, more dangerous phase began. Cooper, now in possession of the money, ordered the pilots to refuel and file a new flight plan to Mexico City. But he had conditions. These were the technical demands that proved his expertise. He ordered them to fly at a low altitude, below 10,000 feet. He ordered the landing gear to remain down and the wing flaps to be set at 15 degrees. And he demanded the cabin remain unpressurized. He knew this combination would slow the 727 to its minimum safe flying speed, just under 200 miles per hour, creating a stable platform for a jump. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off again, heading south. Cooper ordered Tina Mucklow to join the rest of the crew in the cockpit and not come out. He was now alone in the dark, empty cabin. Sometime after 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The aft stairs, the 727's built-in staircase at the tail of the plane, had been opened. The pilots felt the air pressure change. The plane was flying through a driving, freezing rainstorm over a black, unlit forest. And then, at approximately 8:13 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, D.B. Cooper, with $200,000 strapped to his body, walked down those stairs and jumped into the blackness.
When the jet landed in Reno, Nevada 2 hours later, the aft stairs were still dragging on the runway. The cabin was empty. All that was left behind was the killer's black clip-on tie, 2 of the parachutes, and the stub of his cigarette. The manhunt that followed was, and remains, one of the largest and most intensive in U.S. history. The FBI immediately codenamed the investigation NORJAK for Northwest Hijacking. They knew the approximate jump zone, a rugged, densely forested and mountainous area near the Washington-Oregon border. They mobilized the military. Hundreds of soldiers from Fort Lewis, alongside FBI agents and local sheriffs, conducted a massive ground search, grid by grid, in the middle of winter. They found nothing. No body, no briefcase. No parachute, no money. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The FBI's investigation was relentless. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They chased thousands of leads. They were, however, one step behind from the start. They had no idea who Dan Cooper was. The name was an alias. The one piece of physical evidence he left on his tie yielded a partial DNA profile in 2001, but it has never been matched to anyone. The only tangible change to come from the crime was technical. The Cooper vane, a simple mechanical device, was immediately mandated on all Boeing 727s, making it physically impossible to lower the aft stairs while the plane is in the air. D.B. Cooper had, quite literally, changed the design of modern aviation. But he himself remained a ghost. The case grew cold for 9 years. Then, in 1980, the one and only piece of hard evidence ever surfaced. A young boy named Brian Ingram, vacationing with his family, was digging in the sand on the banks of the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar. He uncovered 3 bundles of cash. They were degraded, rotted and half-buried, but they were cash. The FBI was called. They painstakingly confirmed the serial numbers. It was $5,800 of D.B. Cooper's $200,000 ransom. This discovery, which should have solved the case, only deepened the mystery. Tina Bar was miles outside the original search zone. How did the money get there? Did Cooper land in the river and drown, the money washing ashore? Did he bury it there, intending to come back? Did he lose it during the jump? The $5,800 was the first and last physical trace D.B. Cooper ever left on the world. The rest of the money and the man himself remain missing. In 2016, the FBI, after 45 years, officially suspended the active investigation, leaving NORJAK as one of its most famous and most frustrating failures. The failure of the investigation allowed a new, more powerful narrative to take over: the myth. D.B. Cooper was no longer a criminal. He was a folk hero. In the small towns of the Pacific Northwest, he became a legend. Bars and diners held D.B. Cooper days. Songs were written about him. T-shirts were printed celebrating him as the ultimate anti-establishment rebel, the guy who stuck it to the man and got away with it. He was the embodiment of a romantic cinematic fantasy, the idea that an ordinary person could pull off the perfect crime and simply disappear. But this celebration, this tragic symmetry, completely erases the human cost of that night. While the public was busy creating a hero, the real victims were trying to process their trauma. This was not a game to the flight crew. Tina Mucklow, the 22-year-old flight attendant, was the last person to see Cooper. She was the one who sat next to a man she believed was holding a bomb, a man who held her life in his hands for hours. The ordeal profoundly affected her, so much so that she later left the airline industry and sought a quiet life in a convent. Florence Schaffner, the pilots, The passengers who were told nothing, they were all victims of a profound act of terror. Their trauma is the part of the story that the folk hero myth conveniently forgets. The other victim of this crime was the entire concept of air travel. D.B. Cooper's jump was the death of the golden age of flying. His crime exposed a vulnerability so profound, so simple, that the entire industry was forced to change overnight. Within a year, the first rudimentary airport security checkpoints began appearing. The idea of walking onto a plane without being searched, without showing ID, vanished forever. The public celebrated a man's escape. But the price of that escape was the loss of innocence for an entire industry. Every time we stand in a security line, every time we take off our shoes or have our bags scanned, we are living in the world that D.B. Cooper created. The symmetry is tragic. The public gained a myth, but we all lost our freedom to travel. He didn't just steal $200,000. He stole the trust that was the very foundation of air travel.
For 50 years, the central question has always been, did he survive the jump? The FBI, for its part, officially believes he died. The academic twist in this case is not who he was, but what he was. The popular myth paints Cooper as an elite paratrooper, a military-trained commando like Rambo. But the facts, when analyzed by experts, point to a very different and far more compelling theory. The academic twist is this. D.B. Cooper was almost certainly not an expert skydiver. He was an expert in airplanes. Think about it. As many military paratroopers have pointed out, no expert would choose to jump in his conditions. He jumped at night into a freezing 20-degree windstorm, in a business suit and loafers with no helmet, into a dense, mountainous forest. The primary parachute he used was a dumb, low maneuverability chute, and the reserve chute he was given was sewn shut for training purposes, a fact he either didn't know or didn't check. His escape plan was, in short, suicidal. But his hijacking plan was brilliant. His knowledge of the Boeing 727 was not common knowledge. He knew about the aft stairs. He knew the precise flap settings, altitude, and airspeed needed to keep the plane stable. This suggests he wasn't a soldier. It suggests he was an aviation industry insider. This theory reframes the entire mystery. We shouldn't be looking for ex-Green Berets. We should be looking for a disgruntled Boeing employee from the Seattle plant, a flight line mechanic, a cargo handler who knew the 727 inside and out. This theory suggests a man who had a flawless plan for getting the money, but a high-risk, low-success rate plan for getting away. He was a man who knew exactly how to hijack the plane, but had a critical gap in his knowledge about how to survive the escape. This is the ultimate takeaway of the D.B. Cooper case. It endures not because of the crime, but because of the void. He is America's perfect Rorschach test. Do you see a reckless fool who fell to his death, or a romantic hero sipping a bourbon on a beach? He is the ultimate John Doe. He achieved what so many desire in the modern age. He became a legend. He committed a crime so perfect, so cinematic, that he erased his own identity and replaced it with a permanent, immortal question mark. The story of D.B. Cooper is not a true crime story. It is the definitive true mystery story of the 20th century.